Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our August webinar series. Today, we are joined for the third session, Regional Perspective on Good Clinical Practices, where regulatory authorities from Latin America will share their national perspective on the implementation of the ICH E6 R3 guideline. We will also address practical consideration and strategies for implementation in an open discussion between regulators and industry. My name is Leonardo Semprún, Global Regulatory Policy Lead for Latin America at MSD, and co-chair of the Regulatory Affairs and Pharmacovigilance Working Group at FIPHARMA. And it is an honor to serve as your moderator for today's session. Thank you for joining us and for contributing to this important regional and international discussion, which is highly relevant for the present and the future of health regulation. Some technical instruction. Before we begin, let me share a few instructions regarding simultaneous interpretation during this webinar. Presentation will be delivered in English. The panel discussion will take place in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Simultaneous interpretation will be available in all three languages during the entire session. To select your preferred language, click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choose Spanish, English, or Portuguese. For the best audio quality, we recommend selecting Mute Original Audio if you are listening in a language different from the speakers. Please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions. If we cannot address all of them during the session, they will be collected and shared afterward. Presentation and recording will also be sent to the email address you used to register. So let's move on with the webinar objectives. The goal of today's webinar is to give a clear overview of the key updates in the E6 Revision 3 guidelines and their importance in improving clinical trials practices while aligning them with international standards. We will also look at the evolution of good clinical practice principles and their practical impact. Importantly, these sessions aim to raise awareness and prepare stakeholders in Latin America by encouraging dialogue and supporting readiness for effective E6 Revision 3 implementation. Our agenda today will highlight the global significance of the E6 Revision 3 guideline, the importance of its adoption in Latin America, how this connects with wider harmonization efforts. We will begin with a presentation on clinical research in Latin America, featuring recommendations based on best practices delivered by Susana Baldini. Next, Peter Toomey and Rebecca Stanbrooks will present the key changes between E6 Revision 3 and E6 Revision 2. Following that, we will hear from Latin American regulatory authorities, Anvisa, and Matt and Coffer. Please, thank you for joining today and their perspective regarding this implementation. Finally, we will close with remarks summarizing the key takeaways, outlining next steps, and encouraging active regional engagement with this important guideline. To start, I would like to give the floor to Susana Baldini, who will present clinical research in Latin America, report of recommendations based on best practices, sharing the findings of a study covering the current state of clinical research across the Latin American countries. Susana is currently the medical director at KM with 29 years of experience in the international pharmaceutical industry. She has held leadership roles in medical affairs, clinical research, regulatory affairs, quality, and health economics at companies such as Merck and Ferring. It's my pleasure to welcome Susana.
Hello, everyone. I will start. Sorry for my voice, but it's the only one I have. And I'm not feeling that well. So are you looking at the presentation I'm sharing?
Yes, Susana.
Is it okay?
You can put in presentation mode.
Yes. So we welcome everyone and thank you for being here. I think it's very important for us to have ICH standards. The authorities from Argentina here, we are very happy that just a year ago we adopted ICH as a country. They will have news shortly. This is the idea of this presentation is to share with you a report that we, as Pharma, as to CD, to prepare as a basis for understanding the ecosystem of clinical trials in Latin America. To understand this, we are all agreeing that the benefits, for clinical research is for patients, health professionals, hospitals, and for the country itself. What happens for the patients? Well, they are able to access effective and new therapies in a very early stage. And also they receive the best care because they are taking care with all the standards of clinical trials. The innovation is what brings patients and population itself the benefits of surviving longer. As you see here, in the last 50 years, we have different benefits on reducing the mortality rate for cardiovascular events and the survival in cancer. And of course, also rates orphan diseases such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Sorry, Susana, this is Leonardo. Can you put your presentation in the presentation mode? You can go to the top, puedes ir al tope de la pantalla en Display Setting y ahí cambias para ponerlo en modo presentación total, porque se ven ahorita dos pantallas. En Display Setting, arriba.
They
Exacto.
are active?
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
But what I did is disconnect the second monitor. It was
Oh,
easier.
good. Thank you.
And for the health professionals, of course, they can get continuing medical education for clinical trials. And also it's important to understand that they will start not as researchers in a phase 1, first in human trial, but maybe to start with steps like real world evidence, real world data, observational studies. Then this culture of research have to be embedded since the degree formation. Spain, for example, also is working with high schools to prepare the society for understanding better what is clinical research. Also, it's easy to form a good network of collaborative scientific activity. And in some cases, it's also a good tool to keep the talent inside the organizations. For the hospitals itself, it represents, and these data are from Spain, where they have a lot of paper published about these savings because they spend less money with the coverage of the medicines in clinical trials. Then this is savings for the pharmacy itself in the hospitals. And the spillover effects also allows to improve the infrastructure of the hospitals and to learn how to work in a clinical study, to have all the SOPs, the standard operating procedures, and trying to improve during the different audits, depending the country, also inspections, leads to better optimization of the processes in the hospital. For the country itself, it's very important, and here also are Spanish data, that it brings an investment. Then is something that for the state itself should be declared of public interest, as it happens over there. And that actually gotten to develop the country as a leader in Europe for clinical trials. The important thing also is that the employment that generates clinical research is very good rewarded, and is very high quality employment. Then what happens? If you see here, many continents, many countries and regions, US is responsible for 46% of the R&D expenses, and we only have 1%. That means that we are bad, or that means that we have a lot of potential. I think the idea of this report is just to show how the potential for our region is very important to be addressed. And for that reason, we took Spain, where city is located, to show how we could reach a good potential. And CD based the project in two parts. First, to identify the gaps. What happens in our countries that don't allow the proper development of this is actually a productive activity, a knowledge economy, clinical research. And based on this gap identification, to issue recommendations that are based in the model followed by Spain. How they do that? Well, first, they elaborated a survey. That survey is conduced to interview with different participants, clinical research organizations, companies, health authorities, and other agencies that or entities that perform clinical trials. They also made a research using clinicaltrials.gov for metrics and any data source of public information. They validated the information recovered, and they issued this report. Then what is in the report? And you will be able, I didn't include the link, but I'm sure it will be shared with you via chat. We find here an introduction and some executive summary, the description of the methodology. And the idea is to see a history, a long history of what happened with clinical research. Then it had chosen to be the analyze, have it chosen to analyze the data every 5 years. Then there was a description of the identified gaps. There was a listing of the different recommendations. Then there are annexes for each country that you can check for quick information. Well, here we see the barriers that we found, the pain points. This is ordered in a way that we show at first the more relevant barriers and last the less relevant. Please take into consideration that the study included different countries with different level of maturation in clinical research. Those includes clinical trials phase 1, 2, 3, and also 4. Thus, maybe this is a dynamic field, and are countries who has more relevant barriers in the last ones, and countries who may differ on this categorization. But at least to have a good idea of the 10 more important barriers is to have human resources that is motivate and properly train how to manage and how to increase the clinical research. There is a lack in general of metrics for competitivity, and also the location of different spaces for doing the clinical research in the hospitals. You know, we need closed spaces to store drugs and materials, also information or access to computers that are used in the clinical trials. This is maybe also a barrier. Also a problem in the time, the delay of the approval of the protocols in different countries, and the lack of a country or a country decision, a political decision that is based on the value of the clinical research. Also, we have regulatory issues where we lack harmonization. The society have the opportunity to improve the acceptance of clinical trials, and also the network sometimes of clinical research could be improved because the different motives don't allow the different scientists to work together in these networks or refer patients or to be included in the clinical guidelines. And the last is to have mechanisms for using decentralized elements in trials. Argentina actually was the fifth authority, and AMAT, well, not Argentina, but AMAT was the fifth authority on the world to issue a guide for the decentralized clinical trials, and the first in Latin America. And these barriers can be grouped in three categories, which is resources, strategy, and society. What recommendations we have to ensure that these barriers could be get over with? Well, the first one we got here is the commitment of the country. The state, the nation must declare that this is a activity, a productive activity of country interest, of public interest for development of the country. That helps a lot because when this is aligned and it comes from the top of the state, it makes easier for the other authorities to work together, because it's not just the Ministry of Health. We have to work with Ministry of Economy, Ministry of if it is another one or the same in the same ministry, knowledge economy. We have to work with logistics that that includes customs. We have to work with entities that cover taxes. And this is a very complicated situation that have to be make easier for the establishment of a good public policy. Then to help to get this research gene inside the medical students, because otherwise, if we don't work with the people during the grade training, when they get to the hospitals, they don't have this culture of R&D or of critical thinking to perform their own also clinical trials. Of course, without resources, without money, it's very difficult to get the clinical trials made. And with this, I don't mean the investment of the companies of the clinical or the clinical research organization. Sometimes there are no ways to pay to the researchers because the bureaucracy path is not created. Then it's very important that for the people who work in here in this field. Also, harmonization. In the case of Argentina, is have a different way because we have a federal country, and it's very maybe more similar to Spain because the requirements in each jurisdiction, each state of the country, is different, and also have to be speed up all the processes, not only the regulatory but the administrative logistics. We have a lot of time that could be gained in the process. Also to have metrics. If we don't have metrics, we don't know where we are, and we don't know how are we improving, or if we are not improving, we are going back. Then it's very important to have these metrics. And if the metrics are done by the government, but it's even better. Otherwise, we as companies should provide these metrics. To get public information to reach the society via different social media or TV or radio, to educate them about the clinical research, the importance of the clinical research. We know the pandemics helped a little bit, but there is also a way to keep improving the knowledge and empowering the population about clinical trials. And last but not least, to have something to strengthen the cooperation when we talk about decentralized trials or trials using elements that are decentralized. This is very important because at first we have places that could maybe not agree with decentralization because they have a wrong perspective. But I think it's very important for the institutions and the hospitals to understand that they could also be providers of different services of elements in decentralized clinical trials. As you see at the bottom, there were 39 recommendations based on 61 good practices that would recover. So this is a very enjoyable reading for when you have the time. Here is just a summary for you to get. So what we should do to improve and to get the momentum for the clinical trials in our countries. Well, surely if we work in only one field, we won't get a result. We need to empower different researchers, different actors, so different stakeholders to work together and to find synergies. Then to be able to have metrics. If we don't know, we don't have a number, it's the same as having nothing. It doesn't exist. And to
Susana,
know that,
sorry,
yes,
this is Leonardo. Just a gentle reminder. You have about 1 minute left. Uh, we are over time.
okay. And
Thank you.
the clinical research is a productive activity. And as you have seen, we have 1% of the representation in the global participation. So we have a good potential for our reach. So, Leonardo, the last slides. Thank you very much.
Just in time. Thank you, Susana. You read my mind. Thank you. Thank you very much, Susanna. Yes, Susanna, for sharing these valuable insights. So now let's move on the next presentation, E6 Revision 3 Guideline Revision, and the key challenge with section-based insight delivered by Peter Tomei and Rebecca Stambrook. We will begin with Peter, Head of Inspection at the EMA and Regulatory Chair of the expert group drafting the ICA GCP E6 Revision 3. He also chairs the EU GCP Inspectors Working Group. Peter brings extensive experience in pharmacovigilance, medical affairs, good distribution practices with previous role at the HPRA in Ireland and the UK AMHRA. Please note that Peter's presentation from the email will be shared as a pre-record video to ensure we can benefit from his insight despite timing difficulties. So let's go with the video.
Hello, my name is Peter Toomey. I am the Head of Inspections here at the European Medicines Agency in Amsterdam. I also had the privilege of being the Regulatory Chair of the Expert Working Group, which was responsible for revising the principles and Annex 1 of ICH E6 or 3, Good Clinical Practice. I would like to thank the organisers of this event today who have invited me to give you an overview of the main changes of the Good Clinical Practice Guideline. Before continuing, I would like to stress that these views are my own and not intended to be on behalf of the organisation or ICH. So, what are we going to cover today? Well, let's take a step back and let's learn about the background and history of ICH E6. Then let's explore why there was a need to change the guideline, what the main changes were, and indeed how this guideline is being implemented. So, good clinical practice. It is a globally recognized standard which applies to ethical, scientific, and quality aspects around the conduct of clinical trials that involve human participants. The real benefit of GCP is it has facilitated mutual acceptance of clinical trials which have been conducted anywhere in the world, really. If you conduct a trial somewhere in the world and it adheres to ICH GCP, there is a very good chance it's going to be recognized by the regulatory authority in which you are submitting an application for a new product. The guideline itself, it should be read in conjunction with other ICH guidelines. And I'd particularly like to draw your attention to ICH E8, released a couple of years ago, and this covers general considerations for clinical trials. And indeed, the guideline itself should be read in conjunction with any local regulatory requirements. Now, there's a picture here in the bottom corner of your screen of what was R2, and as you can see, a very concise guideline. In fact, it can fit into the lab coat pocket of a busy investigator. And we took that spirit with us. We wanted this guideline to be clear, concise, and readable for some of our very busy stakeholders. Now, a little history lesson. GCP is nearly 30 years old. It was first released back in 1996, and you can think since then all of the changes we have had in the clinical trial landscape. The first major revision of ICH GCP, it happened in 2016, and what happened there was an addendum introduced to the E6 guideline. It encouraged the implementation of risk-based and proportionate approaches, and indeed it made updates to the guideline to acknowledge and take into account that we had moved to an electronic era, many records, many electronic tools, and so on, were all being conducted in using electronic tools. Now, there was a rewrite of the guideline, which started in 2019, and which I'm talking about today. This was finalized earlier this year, and it was a rewrite of the guideline. That might seem a bit concerning. You say a rewrite, that seems like you have completely changed the guideline. Well, what I would say is the foundations you find in the previous iteration of E6 remain the same and constant. However, as we'll learn in the next few slides, this guideline was considerably changed to take into account the evolving clinical trial landscape and the real need to acknowledge that this guideline should be applied in a proportionate, risk-based manner. And we'll come to that very, very soon. But why did we embark on such an exercise? What was the reason for such a change? Well, stakeholders were listened to. Feedback had been received. In particular, there was feedback which stated that this guideline was being applied to types of research where it was never intended. For example, research which did not involve the use of medicinal products. Indeed, there was concerns that there was a one-size-fits-all approach. No matter how simple or how risky, no matter how complex your trial may be, whatever situation perhaps is being run in, there appeared to be a one-size-fits-all approach being applied, which of course wouldn't be appropriate. There was also concerns, or were concerns, that there was difficulties in adhering to the guideline, particularly in different situations. We perhaps all remember the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all remember how we had to move to conducting trials differently, greater use of electronic technologies, greater use of remote approaches where appropriate. And there was concern with the way GCP was written that it didn't account for the changes of the scenarios where you would be conducting a trial. And there was general concern that there was an overinterpretation, an overly rigid interpretation and application of the standards. If you look at the concept paper, which was written right at the start of the revision as part of R3, it acknowledged that trials have varying complexities, varying degrees of risks, and indeed they use various evolving technologies, and thus it was felt a rewrite was required. Okay, well, what were some of the main changes? As I alluded to, it was a rewrite of E6R2, and in particular, there was a focus to modernize the GCP principles and indeed the associated annexes, and we will come to that in a few moments. It aligned E6 with E8, the document I mentioned a few slides ago, and it also introduced a new annex, Annex 2, which focuses on the use of alternative trial types, data sources, and technologies. A main change was making sure that there was a clear and concise scope, clearly stating this guideline applies to research which involves humans, which involves medicinal products, and indeed, generally speaking, for trials that are intended to be submitted as part of a marketing authorization application. And right at the outset, it was stated that it's expected that how you conduct your trial should be fit for purpose. How you read the guideline, you should focus on the principles and the objective of those principles and how they should be achieved without getting overly lost in the detail or over rigidly reading and applying the guideline. And there was a focus on the principles. There was a focus on the main spirit and reason of those principles. And indeed, there was a focus on the need to apply the guideline in a proportionate manner and also to consider critical to quality factors. Those terms will be explored again in a little bit more detail later, so don't worry. But overall, another main change was to provide flexibility. The guideline, every provision was looked at and it was considered, do we need to change wording to provide flexibility where needed, acknowledging the diversity of trial designs, the different types of risks, different data sources, and so on, and indeed to accommodate advances in technology. And that's one point I would like to dwell on. We don't know all of the advances of technologies that may be coming down the tracks. We know, however, that there are exponential growth in the use of technologies. And a main consideration here was to try and future-proof the guideline, write it in such a way that does not stifle the use of new technologies where they are appropriate. A core focus is that quality by design should be implemented. So when you're designing your trial, you should consider quality and build in quality upfront. Also, critical to quality factors should be identified. That is, those factors that have the greatest impact on your reliability of trial results and indeed trial patient safety, rights, and well-being, and you should divert your focus and attention to those areas. Overall, clinical trial processes and risk mitigation strategies, they should be implemented to support the conduct of the trial that's proportionate to the importance on trial data being collected and indeed the risks on trial participants. And overall, trial design should be operationally feasible and avoid unnecessary complexities and thus burden. House analogy was used to describe the new structure of the guideline. The principles are the foundations of GCP, and you see them here at the bottom of the house. I would encourage readers of the guideline to put their primary focus on the principles, understanding the principles, what they really mean, the spirit of them, why they are there. Then you have the additional detail included in the annexes. So for example, Annex 1 contains detail around the responsibilities and requirements placed upon the ethics committees, investigators, sponsors, and it has a new data governance section. That detail will help you to comply with the principles, but just remember where to focus and not to overly rigidly focus your attention on some of the minutiae within the annexes. Then you have Annex 2, a new annex which aims to provide additional considerations, considering the alternative trial types and indeed new technologies. Overall, however, all of this package fits in with the ICH GCP guideline. But I must stress the principles are the foundation. For those of you familiar with R2, you may be wondering, well, you've rewritten, how does everything map across together? What you see here in this very handy table is an overview of the principles included in R3 on the left-hand side and how that maps across to the previous principles in R2. What you will notice there is that there are two new principles. One on risk proportionality, principle number 7, and one on roles and responsibilities, principle number 10. And let's move in and look at those. So, two new principles in R3. What do they mean? How do you explore them? Now, what I would say before getting into this is I'm going to give you an overview of the principles and some of the changes R3 brought about. But I would encourage you, of course, to go and read the guideline. There's no substitute for that, and really get familiar with it. But anyway, principle number 7, to begin with, it talks about trial processes, measures and approaches. And really the overarching point here, coming back to what I said earlier, is that they should be implemented in a way that is proportionate to the risks, to the trial participants, and the importance of data collection. And also a new component here, it states that they should avoid unnecessary burden being placed on trial participants and indeed our busy investigators. It goes into more detail then. It talks about the processes. As I outlined earlier, they should be proportionate to the risks. They should support the objectives of the trial without adding unnecessary complexity. There should be a focus, of course, on the risks associated with the trial participants. And we know this all along. The right, safety and well-being of trial participants is of more importance than anything else in the trial. And indeed, risks too critical to quality factors, the concept we talked about earlier, they should be managed proactively and adjusted where necessary. Now, a second new principle is it clarifies roles and responsibilities. It talks about how they should be clear and they should be documented appropriately. It outlines how a sponsor and investigator may transfer or delegate tasks, including to service provider, but as we would always be familiar with, they should retain the overall responsibility. But it does go and give more detail to talk about how agreements should be clearly defined. They should give the roles, activities, and responsibilities. And again, it stresses that the investigator and sponsor should maintain appropriate oversight. So two new principles. However, perhaps we have been familiar with these concepts from R2. We know that processes should be risk-based and proportionate, but now it's a standalone principle, hammering home how important that is. And we always knew that the sponsor and investigator could transfer or delegate activities, but now it's crystal clear that they need to be documented appropriately. There needs to be proper and proportionate oversight, and that's a fundamental component. But now I'm going to go and look at the rest of the principles as they appear within R3. And what I've done is I've highlighted areas where we have had particular changes that will be of relevance. Now, again, these principles are based on the previous iterations of E6, so you would be familiar with these concepts. But first off, it talks about how trials which are they should be conducted in accordance with ethical principles. We're very aware of that, a cornerstone of clinical research. And indeed, the right, safety, and well-being of participants is paramount. Now, what's new here is there is a component which states that when you design your trial, you should not be unnecessarily excluding particular patient populations. In particular, if those participants are representative of important patient groups. Staying on the ethical components, we talk about informed consent. It has always been an integral feature around research. R3 introduces the aspect of assent, where you involve minors in a trial, their views should be taken into appropriate consideration. It also introduces the need to have clear and concise information in the informed consent. Any of us who have seen an informed consent form in recent times, I think may agree they've become incredibly long and detailed. And then you ask yourself the question, well, is all this detail needed? Is this too detailed for a trial participant to really understand? So it's important that that information is as clear and concise as possible. It also talks about how technologies and alternative methods of informed consent can be used, which is very relevant in this digital era. And it introduced the concept of legally authorized representatives in emergency situations where perhaps someone doesn't have the capacity to consent. However, region dependent, the use of a legal representative may be appropriate. As always, trials should be subject to an independent review by the Ethics Committee, but R3 introduced very clearly within the principles that a periodic review of the trial by the Ethics Committee should also be conducted in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. Clinical trials should be scientifically sound for their intended purpose, as outlined in principle number 4. And again, it also talks about how a periodic review of current scientific knowledge and approaches should be conducted to determine whether the trial needs to be modified. Do you need to amend the protocol and the way you're conducting the trial in line with new information as it may arise? Principle 5 talks about the trials should be designed and conducted by qualified individuals. We've always had this. It does acknowledge that different levels of training and expertise may be needed across all phases of the trial, depending on the activities being conducted. Now, Principle 6 talks about how quality should be built into the scientific and operational design and conduct of the trials. And what R3 really hammers home, as always, it talks about fitness for purpose, but also building quality in prospectively, building it in from the start when it comes to designing your trials, which will hopefully avoid problems down the line when trials are being conducted. Now, we talked earlier about Principle 7, which is new, so I won't dwell on that. However, Principle 8, again, talks about your protocol needed to be clear, concise, scientifically sound. All of these were outlined in R2. But what R3 does do, it really hammers home how a well-designed protocol is fundamental to good trial conduct. Now, principle number 9 talks about how clinical trials should generate reliable results. Of course, it's a cornerstone of trial conduct and the output of trials. But indeed, principle 9 really focuses in how the quality and amount of information generated should be fit for purpose, and it should be sufficient to provide confidence in the trial results and support good decision making. Now, the term sufficient is very deliberate. We're not talking about perfect data, we're talking about sufficient data. And that's quite important as we realize trials can't be perfect, but the data needs to be sufficient. So there's a nuance there. It talks about how systems and processes used to capture, manage, and analyze data should be fit for purpose. And another new area is it really encourages transparency so that trials are being registered on public portals and results are being made available, in particular with local regulatory requirements. Now, Principle 10, Roles and Responsibilities, is also new, and we talked about that earlier. But then we've Principle 9. It talks about IMP, how it should be manufactured in accordance with good manufacturing practice. A new component there is it really stresses on how treatment assignments, they should be done in a way which maintains the blind, always a common consideration. Here's a table which maps across components in R3 on the left-hand side and how they were outlined in R2. What we see here from informed consent is, as outlined in the principles, varying approaches, including the use of electronic technology and remote consenting where appropriate can be utilized. The information needs to be clear and concise and avoid unnecessary volume and complexity. It also outlines exceptional situations where alternative measures could be used, and indeed it expands on assent in minors. There is further clarification on the levels of evidence of qualifications required. There is flexibility for documentation. It will depend on the type of activities being conducted by the staff member. It talks about how if a staff member is undertaking activities within their routine clinical activities, that then you can consider whether they really need to be added to the delegation log or if any additional training is needed. And it also clarifies expectations around the use of computerized systems at the investigator site. A particular area of focus is delegation documentation and giving a level of clarity around situations where someone may not need to be included on delegation activities, for example, where they're performing activities in line with routine care. We now move to the sponsor section, and as always, this table shows you how components in R3 map across with R2. So then in the sponsor section, for monitoring, it clarifies the monitoring is a primary quality control activity, how you can have centralized monitoring, how your routine monitoring could be on-site or remote, depending on the level of oversight needed, and indeed how your monitoring strategy really needs to focus on what is important to the trial and the safety of patients. Investigation medicinal products. There's also greater clarity here that depending on the risk associated with the use of the product, for example, where a product is already authorized, then you may use currently authorized product information, and your drug accountability activities may be in line with how you would record the use of medicinal products in routine care. And all of this is in line with local regulatory requirements. And as we've seen for the principles, greater detail around quality management, clarifying the use of critical to quality factors, encouraging proportionality, computerized systems and data management, clarifies the importance of certain processes, including blinding, talks about how computerized systems, their requirements should be appropriate and risk-based, and indeed how these requirements should be proportionate to the importance of the computerized system itself and its impact on the data, and further expansion on sponsor oversight. There is a new data governance section. This is for both investigators and sponsors, and it covers areas, for example, safeguarding the blind, data lifecycle elements, goes into computerized systems, their security, validation, what to do in system failure, and indeed technical support and user management. And I think this is a long overdue section of the E6 guideline. Various components here. Talks about how a sponsor should apply quality control to relevant stages of data handling to ensure that data which is generated is sufficient to generate reliable results. Talks about how computerized systems should be fit for purpose and indeed used in a manner that's proportionate to their importance for the safety and result reliability. There is a comprehensive approach included here to data management, as I outlined earlier, and it clarified the meaning of metadata. Essential records is an area which has caused some confusion. In particular, the changes here try to provide guidance to try and empower the sponsor and investigator to consider what records are really fundamental and important to trial conduct, and thus what do I need to consider actually generating and thus retaining. It tries to give a level of flexibility and bring that risk proportionate approach in line with the essential records that you generate and keep. Annex 2, as I alluded to earlier, this addresses GCP considerations that arise from the increased use of alternative design elements, data sources, and technologies. It focuses on decentralized elements, pragmatic elements, and the use of real-world data. And it is estimated that this part of the guideline should reach step 4 in Q4 of this year. So the principles in Annex 1 reached step 4 in January of this year, and they were applicable in the EU from July of this year. Other regions then are following suit and making the guideline applicable in their own territories. Step 4 presentation is available online, which goes through in greater detail some of the areas I just covered. We also hope to have interactive training materials available on the ICH website towards the end of the year. So that can really help you when it comes to training out your investigator sites and sponsor staff and so on. And I would like to draw your attention to an EMA hosted workshop under the umbrella of ACT EU at the following link, which was a day and a half worth of training. It's a deep dive into various different areas of this guideline, and the videos are available online. We had over 2,000 attendees. It was a very well attended workshop, and I'd encourage you to look at it. The presentation slides are also available. I would like to acknowledge the expert working group who worked tirelessly on this guideline. On the right-hand side, you will see a picture of some of the members of those expert working groups. We had representatives from all over the world, Europe, US, Japan, but also the likes of Singapore, China, Brazil, and many other countries throughout the world which gave input to this guideline. We received approximately 7,000 comments during public consultation, which we understand is a record, and we would like to thank everyone that did submit comments. And practical examples that we would have learned and seen from the stakeholder input, as well as inspections, of course, over the years, helped us in focusing our update. In summary, the guideline has been rewritten. There's a new structure. There's a greater emphasis on the principles and the fitness for purpose and risk-based approaches. There's a new annex focusing on new technologies and alternative trial designs. And really, we hope that this rewrite will be future-proof. I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I hope you find it useful, and best of luck when it comes to implementing the guideline. Thank you and goodbye.
Great presentation. Now I would like to give the floor to Rebecca Steinbruch, who has more than 30 years of experience in both the pharmaceutical industry and regulatory agencies. She currently serves as the GCP Strategic Lead at Novartis Pharma. She's also the European Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industry Topic Lead for the ICH E6 Revision 3 Expert Working Group. Rebecca's career includes senior roles at the UK MHRA, where she helped establish inspection programs and co-authored key guidance documents. Rebecca, please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Just bear with me 1 second while I just share my slides. So, can you see the screen? I just wanted to check that.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. So I just want to build on what Peter's already said with regards to E6R3 and go a little bit deeper into what that means for the investigator and the sponsor, and also bring in a little bit about the data governance section. As usual, the usual disclaimer, these are my own views, not those of Novartis or FPIA or the expert working group. And I'd also like to thank Sumitra Sachidananan and Elizabeth Breinhoyd, because I've shamelessly stolen some of their wonderful slides that they've used in various presentations. So I want to talk about a little bit more in depth about the investigator and really sort of pull out some of the glossary terms that you might be interested in, and roles and responsibilities, that blurring of the lines that we see these days, where perhaps the sponsor is contracting an activity that's undertaken under the responsibility of the investigator, but is actually being contracted by the sponsor. So it's a bit of a blurring of the lines there. So how is that handled? Obviously, you want to give a nod to both the investigator and the sponsor in terms of data governance, and then pull out some points about oversight. What does that mean? Also about quality management. So you'll hear terms like critical to quality factors. And the other plea, Peter gave a plea about sort of reading the guideline. There's no substitute for reading the guideline, but don't read the guideline in isolation. Also think about the other efficacy guidelines. So I'd also like to point in the direction of E8R1, General Considerations for Clinical Studies, because that's part of the whole GCP renovation programme. So as Peter did, I'll be using a number of the slides from the Step 4 presentation. So I would also recommend to take a look at the ICH website, because there's a lot of good information in there on the training decks that we have, and also watch this space, as there'll be some training coming out very shortly that's been developed by MRCT in conjunction with ICH, the expert working group. So let's think about the investigator. So the changes from R2 to R3. So here we've sort of clarified that the investigator, can be sort of in some jurisdictions referenced as the investigator stroke institution. So we clarified that sometimes we won't be saying investigator institution all the time. We'll just say investigator, but it also means both. And for those people who are conducting trials with decentralized clinical trial elements, and you heard Peter mention about Annex 2, we did change the definition of trial site. So firstly, we called it investigator site, and then we talked about it being the place where trial-related activities are undertaken or coordinated from under the investigator's oversight. And I'll talk about oversight as well shortly. So, of course, the investigator is responsible for the care of the participant at their investigator site. And I just want to clarify, you can't delegate responsibilities. So the responsibility always resides with the investigator. You can only delegate tasks and activities. So as I mentioned a little while ago, the sponsor might contract some activities on behalf of the investigator, but the investigator retains that responsibility. So I often use myself as an example. So I'm a pharmacist, but if I was contracted by a sponsor to go and take blood as a home nurse, then I would expect the investigator to say, no, we don't want Rebecca Stanbrook doing that. She's not a phlebotomist. So they need to have that responsibility and that ability to almost give it a veto. And of course, it goes without saying that you need to make sure that any delegation is appropriately documented. So now you'll notice that subtle change. So it's a change of word from investigator supervision to investigator oversight. So this is as a result of listening. So the expert working group listened to all of the comments that we had, and actually had a bit of a different activity in how we undertook our work, because we actually had a stakeholder representative group, a group of academics who came in to advise us, and they mentioned about supervision. So to a doctor, supervision is somebody looking over somebody's shoulder to see if somebody is undertaking the task appropriately. Whereas this can mean anything, oversight can mean anything from, yes, they're looking over the shoulder, but to actually just receiving results from somebody, perhaps from a primary care physician or from your local laboratory, what oversight you need. So you need to think about the oversight being appropriate and proportionate to the activities undertaken and the importance of that data. And of course, oversight is right through the whole of the clinical trial conduct process, right from the recruitment of your participants, right through to the reporting of those results. And of course, it includes the informed consent process, which Peter did also mention. So this is a slide that I've shamelessly stolen from Lisbeth Breinhoy, the Danish Medicines Agency. And it's really trying to sort of talk about that new area that we've got, that new section, data governance. So, well, why did we have a new section? Well, it's a long enough guideline as it is without repeating ourselves. And what we recognise, there's a lot more investigator sites with computerized systems. So you think of how many sites have electronic health records. And we need to make sure that those computerized systems are fit for purpose. So that's why, rather than repeating ourselves in the investigator section and the sponsor section, we pulled together those aspects of computerized systems that would be applicable to both in the data governance section. And so this slide really tries to sort of give you a flavour for what types of systems we mean and who deploys those systems. So for instance, if we look in the first row, you'll see that there are systems that are designed specifically for clinical trial purposes. So you might have an electronic investigator site file. It's been designed specifically for use in a clinical trial. You might have systems that are deployed by the sponsor. So, for instance, an interactive response technology system that has been designed specifically for use in the clinical trial, in a clinical setting. Or you might have systems that have been configured, so like your electronic case report forms. But then, of course, you've got systems that weren't specifically designed for use in a clinical trial, but actually they are particularly useful. So I mentioned earlier about electronic medical records. And so that is a hospital system that's been designed to support the patient journey and how the patient is treated at that investigator site or that hospital. But actually, we can utilize some of that data from those electronic health records in the clinical trial. So it's been designed for a different purpose in a clinical trial, but actually we can use the data. And an example of that from a system deployed by the sponsor could be something like a wearable where you just use it off the shelf, but it wasn't specifically designed for use in a clinical trial. So this slide was really designed to get you thinking about the different types of systems and who has oversight of those systems. So where are the systems coming from? But actually then, are they used for a clinical trial, or are they a system that's been designed for another purpose? Whatever it is, you need to make sure that it is fit for purpose. So when you look at the data governance section, you need to look at it in conjunction with some of the sections in both the investigator and the sponsor section. So I wanted to try and pick out a few sections here from the investigator section that you can see that link. So you look at 2.12.10, it talks about use of computerized systems. So, where you've got systems that are deployed by the investigator site, you need to make sure that the computerized system is fit for purpose, that you've got appropriate access permissions. So I think here about where we've got access to electronic health records for perhaps the trial monitor or the auditor from the sponsor. You need to make sure that the access is appropriate for that role. So in the case of a sponsor, you would expect that that access is only allows that particular person to look at the particular patients who are participants in their trial. So the access permissions need to be appropriate. Where you've got perhaps a wearable, So it's been something that has been provided by the sponsor, but then the investigator gives it out to the participants. You need to make sure that it's traceable to that participant. We also added in there about sort of, if there's an incident in the operation, perhaps data isn't being transferred quickly or at an appropriate time point to the clinical trial database, then you need to make sure that the investigator reports those issues in a timely manner to the sponsor. And talking of timely manner, there are data that the sponsor is sort of having generated. So, for instance, these wearables, you get a lot of data coming from wearables, and you need to make sure that the investigator has timely access to that data in a manner which they can utilize. And so I would strongly suggest, look out for what's written in Annex 2 about this. So basically, the investigator needs to have access to all the data in a format that allows them to make medical decisions about the participants in their care. So just in summary for the investigator, the oversight, it needs to be proportionate. So you'll have heard from Peter talking about the risk-based and proportionate approach throughout the R3 guideline. And so think about sort of what is an appropriate oversight depending on the importance of that data, the criticality of the data. And of course, any data management systems that are deployed by the investigator need to be fit for purpose. So, think about those electronic health records. Do they have an appropriate audit trail, for instance? And we also, as I mentioned, recognise that potential blurring of the lines, that at the end of the day, the responsibility still resides with the investigator. So let's move on to the sponsor. So you can't have a clinical trial without a protocol. So I wanted to bring us back to the Step 4 slide deck to talk a little bit about the protocol. So you'll notice that the protocol section has been beefed up a little bit. We talk here about sort of not just withdrawal of trial participation, but we also talk about discontinuation. So here we're thinking about discontinuation by the investigator of that participant. We also tried to bring it up to date with current statistical methodology. You'll also see that there are some places in the old R2 that didn't actually say anything. So I think, if memory serves me correctly, the quality assurance, quality control section and the data handling and record keeping, they were just lines, but with nothing, no context behind it. So we've sort of actually said, well, this is what that means. And when you read the blurb, the introduction to the protocol section and the elements that you would generally expect, it talks about what you would generally expect in a clinical trial protocol. So here, let's just go a little bit deeper into what that means in the protocol. So we wanted to sort of build flexibility in. So we know that each trial will have some protocol deviations, but we need to sort of be able to have the protocol deviations clear, that are the ones that actually matter, so that could have a sort of potential impact on the participants' right, safety and well-being, or the reliability of those trial results. So we said, well, maybe you can write the protocol in sort of a flexible way, so you end up with sort of acceptable ranges. So you'll hear us talk about acceptable ranges, and in R2 we talked about quality tolerance limits. So quality tolerance limits are just a subset of acceptable ranges. So is it that you actually need to draw the blood or have this visit at this particular time point? If not, maybe you can build in some flexibility into the protocol so that you then focus on the protocol deviations which matter. Clinical trial protocols, you heard that I've been in the industry some long period of time. I remember clinical trial protocols that could have been sort of 25, 30 pages. Now we're talking 100 pages. So we're really saying, let's get back to protocols that are clear and concise, and they are operationally feasible. So when you sort of look at E6, it talks also about sort of engagement of stakeholders, so engagement of healthcare professionals, engagement of participants or potential participants in the design of protocols. So really we're saying, make sure it's feasible. Can you actually conduct these tests simultaneously, or is it that you need to conduct them in a sequence? So at the end of the day, we're trying to sort of minimize the unnecessary complexity. And you heard Peter say several times about decreasing burden for the investigator, decreasing burden for participants. So I'd really encourage people to think about what is your research question and what is the best data to collect to be able to answer that research question. And don't collect what you don't need. We also, as I mentioned, we've put a section in there that's not just withdrawal of consent, but also discontinuation, because there could be some instances where perhaps an adverse event is actually an adverse drug reaction, and the investigator thinks that the participant should withdraw from the trial. So I wanted to sort of talk about service providers. So you'll notice that we changed from contract research organisation to service providers. And that was because we've got so many different parties now engaged in providing services for clinical trials that we wanted to sort of have a term which encompassed that. So often sort of you might have some IT type computerized system vendors that perhaps didn't feel that they were contract research organizations because they weren't perhaps the classical full service CRO. And so we wanted to make sure that those organizations were fully aware about sort of the responsibilities in terms of good clinical practice. And of course, you want to make sure that you select the right service providers. So you've got your clinical trial protocol. What is it that I want the service provider to do? Can they undertake the tasks that I'm asking for from the protocol? And of course, at the end of the day, you still need to have that oversight. Although you've delegated some activities to a service provider, as a sponsor, you still retain that responsibility. So you need to have appropriate oversight. Once again, proportionate to the criticality of that data. And of course, sponsors need to select investigators. And so, you need to make sure that the investigators can actually undertake the trial which you are wanting to place at their institution. So you need to make sure that they have a look at the protocol, they have the investigators brochure, so that they can really make an informed decision as well if they're able to recruit that type of participant into the trial. So thinking about sponsor oversight. So once again, it's oversight, and sponsor oversight was something we've talked about for many years, but really wasn't sort of specifically written down in the guideline, and now it is. And at the end of the day, as a sponsor, you want to make sure that you've got that good overview of what's happening in the trial, at the trial site, what's happening with the data, and make sure that that data is and information that you have is a sufficient amount and a sufficient quality to be able to generate your reliability of the trial results, that you're ensuring your participant safety, and it allows you to make appropriate decisions. So, it's once again always about proportionality, making sure that you've got the right information available to be able to make an informed decision. And of course, we need to sort of have a quality management system to do this. It can take various forms. It might be that part of it's part of the protocol if it's an investigator-initiated trial. But at the end of the day, you need to sort of think about how you can de-risk that protocol. So you need to sort of think about the identification of critical to quality factors. So if I don't measure this particular perhaps PK at this particular time point, then it causes an issue in terms of the quality and reliability of those results. So think about that as you're writing the protocol. So almost try and de-risk the protocol. But it's not just a once off. So you need to be sort of thinking about it throughout the course of the trial conduct. And of course, once again, it comes to the proportionality. So, what's the importance of these risks to these critical to quality factors to participants' right, safety, and well-being, and of course, the reliability of the trial results. So you need to sort of think about identifying the risks, evaluating them. Can you actually control the risks? And then communicate those risks as well. So you need to make sure that the investigator and any monitors are aware of potential critical to quality factors and the risks associated with those factors. And of course, it's a cyclical. So you don't just do it once as you write the protocol. You're continually reviewing the data to make sure that no other risks are coming up. And in which case you need to sort of think about perhaps additional risk control measures. And you want to sort of really think about them in terms of the reporting. So your clinical trial report tells the story of what happened during that clinical trial. And so it will include that element of what happened to critical to quality factors and the risks that have been associated with them. And where you've had any quality tolerance limits exceeded, then you need to make sure that you write into that what's the impact of that, what's the impact on the participant protection or the reliability of those trial results. Just to remind you about this diagram again, with the investigator institution deployed systems in the left column and in the right column systems deployed by the sponsor. So what does that mean in terms of the sponsor? So I picked out some terms here. So you'll recognize the fact that in the glossary we now talk about data acquisition tools. So that could be the electronic case report form, but it could also be other technologies. So it could be wearables, it could be the interactive response technology. So what we're saying is that a data acquisition tool is not just a case report form. You'll also notice we brought in the aspect of metadata. So it's really about the information that provides you with confirmation of what that data is. So for instance, the metadata might be telling you who actually entered that data, when they entered the data, if the data had been changed. So it's actually telling you the story of that particular data point. And then of course, those metadata records combine together to provide an audit trail. And so think about when an audit trail should be reviewed. So think about that in terms of all of those activities that you're undertaking for sponsor oversight. When might you want to be looking at audit trails? So thinking about data governance in relation to the sponsor section, particularly look at sections 3:16.1. And once again, we're talking about proportionality. Think about focusing your activities on that data of higher criticality. Conversely, how we talked about the investigator needed to have timely access to data, the sponsor needs to make sure that any data that they're being generated perhaps through wearables, that is provided in a timely manner to the investigator. And of course, you need to make sure that you're not inadvertently unblinding. We've got a lot more computer systems these days, and a lot more of these systems are deployed by sponsors at the investigator site. So you need to make sure that the investigator and their investigator site staff know how to navigate these systems to get access to the data that they need to make the medical decisions for the participants in their care. We also sort of talked a little bit more about data management steps. So, how do you make sure that the data is of suitable quality before it goes into the analysis? We talk about sort of database locks. How do you make sure the data is appropriate? We also talk about interim analysis. So we haven't talked about interim analysis and how do you manage that? So for instance, if you've got a trial where you've got a double-blind trial and you said you're going to have an interim analysis, how do you make sure that you still keep a blinded trial team so that when they write the final report, that they don't have any bias from what's seen in that interim analysis? Also, for final analysis, you need to make sure that the edit access is restricted. So if you look at some of the inspection findings, you'll see that when they've gone to conduct the inspection, the data is different from what the submission was because the edit access wasn't removed. So actually there were changes to the data made. So make sure that you've got sort of the appropriate access permissions have been removed once you've got your moving on to the final analysis. So of course, when you think about the systems deployed by the sponsor, well, you need to have a record of all the systems that you're utilising in the trial. That goes without saying. And at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you've got appropriate validation. Once again, proportionate to the importance of that system within the criticality of that data. Access to the system. So, make sure you've got an access to the users of the system and what their roles are in the system. And if something changes, make sure that that role is either revoked. So quite often you might have doctors on rotation. They might go into help support a clinical trial, but then they move into another area. So you need to make sure that ability to access the system is then revoked. And of course, you need to sort of make sure that that's in line with the delegation so that the role that that person is undertaking in the trial is mirrored by what's actually in the delegation log. And as I mentioned before, at the investigator side, the sponsor needs to make sure that the systems are fit for the purpose and that any potential risks are appropriately mitigated. So once again, always think about what is the importance of that data and so using a proportionate approach. So I mentioned some of the glossary terms as we were going along. I'd like to sort of just draw out a couple more. So assent. So where you've got minors that are included in a clinical trial, you perhaps have the parent or guardian has said, I want to sign them up for the trial. But if the child is of a sort of a certain age, so perhaps sort of 7 or upwards, they should be able to provide an assent, and it needs to be age appropriate. So I've seen assents where you've got sort of young school children and that it's more of sort of a diagrammatic, sort of a caricature, up to where somebody's getting towards adulthood. There's more sort of detailed information. So it really needs to be appropriate. We talked about service providers. Also want to sort of think about some of the revised glossary terms. So I draw your attention to the adverse events, adverse drug reactions. You'll notice we put all the safety piece in one place now, so you don't have to flick through where it comes A for adverse event through to serious adverse event down in S. It's all together, and we actually sort of gave in a definition of what a suspected, unexpected, serious adverse drug reaction is as well. So it sort of really clarified everything there for you. The only other thing I'll mention here is about source records. So we recognise that records can take various forms, and so it's not just about the data. So that's why we sort of broaden that definition, because it can be any document that's sort of really helping to tell the story of what happened in the clinical trial. So I've really sort of talked about that. The only other one I perhaps would bring up is about subjects we changed to participants. So once again, we listened. So patient advocacy groups strongly said, we're not subjects. We participate in a trial. So that's why we've sort of changed it to participants, if you are wondering. Then I'd just like to mention essential records. I know Peter mentioned essential records, and what was happening was with that before, during, and after a clinical trial, people were sort of using that as a checkbox. What we're trying to do is get people thinking, what makes an essential record? You know, so we gave examples of what could be essential records, but also gave the thought process for how you could consider what is an essential record. So at the end of the day, E6R3 is all about thinking. So I'd like you to go away with that thought in your head. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Your contribution certainly helped us better understand the challenge and opportunities in this area. So we will now move to the panel discussion, co-moderated by Cecilia D'Antuono and myself. Dr. Cecilia D'Antuono is currently Regional Delivery Lead for the Americas at Bristol Myers Squibb. She's member of the IFPMA expert group for ICA E6 training. It's also my pleasure to introduce our regional expert from the health authorities who will share their perspective on Latin American regulatory on the E6 revision 3 implementation. Miriam Motizuki works at Anvisa Clinical Trials Office as a GCP inspector and clinical trial reviewer and participates in the ICH E6 Revision 3 expert working group. She's an expert in clinical pharmacology. Laura Traversi is a physician specialized in pediatrics and clinical pharmacology. She's joined ANMAT in 2012 and currently is heading the clinical trials department in ANMAT. Welcome. Rosa Guadalupe Legaspi is medical surgeon with a master in epidemiology and pharmaceutical regulation, working at COFEPRIS in international authorization. She has contributed to the ICH E17 adoption, represented Mexico in the Pan American Health Organization and ICMRA Forum. So please join me in welcoming our panelists today. Now we will begin the question and answer session. To start, I would like to direct the first question to Anvisa. I will formulate the question in Portuguese, so to give the audience the chance to hear in the local language. So, for Anvisa, quais são, na visão da Anvisa, os principais desafios para adaptar as práticas atuais aos requisitos da ICSA R3?
Obrigada, Leonardo. Primeiro, eu queria agradecer o convite. Então, em relação a essa pergunta, a gente viu, né, nas apresentações anteriores da Rebeca,
I
do
want to
Peter,
thank you for your invitation. And we saw in this question, previous presentations by Rebecca
incluindo até uma
and
nova
Peter, is
versão,
it
né, que é a
R3
de
it brings a
corrigir
lot of
dados.
updates,
Então,
including
tem
a
muitas
new update, which is the
adaptações para serem
data
feitas, né,
conversion,
ao
and
longo
there are a lot of
desenvolvimento clínico.
adaptations to be
Mas a mensagem
made
final,
in
que até a
clinical
Rebeca
development.
comentou, né, que o
But the
R3,
final message
ele
that
traz a
Rebecca
mensagem de
mentioned
sempre
is that
ter esse
R3
pensamento
brings the
baseado na
message
qualidade,
that
né?
we
Então,
should
ter sempre
always
uma análise
be
crítica
thinking
de
based on
de
quality.
todo o
We always have
desenvolvimento
to have
clínico,
a critical
todo
analysis of
o
all the
ciclo de vida
clinical
de um ensaio
development,
clínico. Então, desde o planejamento,
of the entire
conclusão até a
life
finalização do
cycle
estudo,
of the clinical trial,
o desenvolvedor, né, e os envolvidos com a pesquisa
from the
clínica
beginning
tem
of
que
the end
pensar
to the end
se aquilo realmente é
of
crítico, se
the
aquilo realmente
study.
importa para o estudo,
And
se
the
ele é
developer
adequado ao
needs to
propósito
think
do
if this is
estudo, né?
critical
Também
or
pensar
not, if
os
it's
riscos, se
important for the
aquilo
study, if it's
realmente
adequate for the
crítico ou
study,
não. Então, eu acho que o
and
principal
thinking about the
desafio,
risks.
né, eu vejo que é mudar essa
And the
forma de
main
pensar.
challenge
Então,
is here,
para
or
cada
challenge here is
fase,
to
né, para cada
change
situação do
the
estudo,
way of
sempre ter esse
thinking
pensamento crítico. Ah,
for
será que
each
isso realmente é crítico para o
situation
meu estudo?
of
Será
the
que
study. We have to think
isso vai
if
afetar a
this is
qualidade do
really
meu estudo, a
critical for
integridade dos
my
dados?
research.
Então,
Will this
hoje,
affect the
o
quality and
R3 ele
integrity
traz
of the
isso de que não
data
existe uma
of the
resposta
study?
pronta, né,
So
uma
R3
receita
brings
pronta. Então,
this.
para cada
There
estudo, a gente vai ter que
isn't
pensar se realmente
a ready
isso é
recipe. We need
adequado
to
ou
think
não
for
ao
each
propósito do
study
estudo.
if
E daí, por outro
this
lado, isso
adapts to
também
the
traz uma
purpose of the
flexibilidade,
study
né?
or not. And on
Então,
the other hand,
como
it
o Peter
brings
comentou no
flexibility,
começo, os
as
princípios, eles
Peter
são a base de
mentioned at the
tudo. Então,
beginning
todos os estudos, eles vão seguir esses
of the
princípios, mas
principles
como
are the
fazer
basis
isso,
for
aí o
everything.
anexo
All the
ele traz
studies
de uma
need to
forma
follow these
folheada, mas com a
principles,
flexibilidade
but
de
how
cada
do we do this? R3 brings this, but we have to have the flexibility for each study. We have to think about what the focus will be for the study within the risks in a proportionate manner. In general,
Obrigado,
this
Miriam.
is the
Fique
main
claro que esse
challenge.
desafio envolve
Thank you so
não
much,
apenas
Miriam.
ajustes técnicos, mas também aspectos estruturais. So, obrigado
These
por
are
essa
technical
contribución.
and structural aspects. Thank you so much.
Bueno, sigo yo en castellano.
Okay,
Esta pregunta es
this
para
is me
Dr.
in
Legaspi,
Spanish. This
para
is for
ver si
Dr. De
es la
Gaspi and
misma
Dr.
pregunta en
Traversi.
español,
It's the
desde
same
la
question in
perspectiva de las
Spanish from
agencias
the perspective
regulatorias.
of the
¿Cuáles
regulatory
creen que
agencies.
son hoy los
What do you think are the
principales
main
desafíos en
challenges
adaptar las
today
prácticas
in
actuales que
adapting
tenemos
current
hacia
practices
los
that we
nuevos
have
requerimientos
towards the new
que
requirements
implican la ICH 6
involved
R3,
in
revisión 3?
ICHE
Doctora
6
Legaspi, si
Review
quiere
3?
comenzar,
Dr.
y
Legaspi,
después
if you'd
pasamos a
like to
Dr.
start, and
Traversi.
then we'll go to Dr. Traversi.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you so much.
Pues bueno, uno de los
Well, one
principales
of the
retos
main
es pues tener la
challenges
implementación en el
is to
país
have the
de la
implementation
guía
in the
como tal.
country of the
Un
guideline per
poquito de
se.
historia,
A little bit of
México
history. Mexico
se volvió miembro de
became
la ICH
a
en
member
el
of
2021.
ICH in
A raíz de eso, hemos
2021.
estado
And based on this or after
ajustar
this,
el
we've been
marco
trying to adapt
normativo
the
para poder
regulatory
contar con un
framework to be
proyecto,
able to
una
have
norma,
a
perdón, una norma
regulation
que establezca todos los
that
criterios
establishes all
establecidos
the
en la guía
criteria
de
established
E6
in the E6
con la
guideline
última revisión
with the latest
y se va a
review,
llamar
and it
norma
will be called
262. Esto se ha estado
Standard 262.
trabajando con
And we've been
diferentes
working
sectores
on this with
y
different
esto va a
sectors,
generar
and this will
pues que
generate
México esté
that
en
Mexico
las mejores prácticas
be in
internacionales,
the
se
international
ajuste
best
a
practices
las
and
regulaciones
follows
tanto
the
locales como
regulations both
internacionales
locally and
y eso va
internationally.
a generar
And this
que se
will
posicione
cause
como un
the
país
Mexico or will
importante para
position
temas
itself
de
as an
ensayos
important country
clínicos.
for clinical
A
trials.
raíz de esto también,
And
pues bueno,
based
se
on
han estado
this,
estableciendo
we've
otras
also been
estrategias
establishing
para
other
pues también
strategies
capacitar.
to
Como
also
saben,
train. As you
en
know,
nuestro país también estamos
in our
migrando a la
country, we're
parte
also migrating
digital, ¿no?
to
Entonces también ya
digital.
las solicitudes son
So all the
digitales
requests
y
are now
bueno,
digital,
estamos
and
trabajando pues en
we
esa
are
gobernanza de
working
datos
in
que
this
ahora en la
data
guía se
governance
está planteando
that
de una forma
is
más
being
sólida
stated
y
in a
eso
more
pues bueno
solid
creo que es
manner in
uno
the
de los
guideline.
mayores
And I
retos
think
que
this is one
tenemos
of
en
the
este
greatest
momento.
challenges that we currently have.
Bueno, buenos días, buenas
Okay,
tardes a
good morning, good
todos.
afternoon, everyone.
En principio,
In
para poner en
principle,
contexto la situación
to put into
regulatoria actual de
context the
Argentina y
regulatory
después contarles un
situation
poco
in
los desafíos
Argentina,
que
and then
nosotros
tell
vemos
you a
para la
little bit about the
implementación de la
challenges that we
guía,
see for the implementation
me
of this
parece importante
guideline.
comentarles
I think
que
it's important to tell you that
Argentina formó
Argentina
miembro, o sea, comenzó a ser miembro de
started to
ICH el
be
año
a member
pasado,
of ICH
en el
last year
2024,
in
y con la
2024
normativa que hoy tenemos
with the
vigente, que se
regulations that we
alineaba
currently have
a
today
la
that
guía
aligned
ICH 6
to the
R2.
ICH ICR2
A partir del
guideline.
año pasado
And
y hasta
then
la
starting
fecha,
last
nosotros
year
iniciamos un
into the present
camino
date, we
para
started a
actualización de
path
la
for
normativa y que
updating
esté
of the
también
regulation
alineada con
so
la
that it could also
ICH
be
6
aligned with
R3.
ICH
Ayer
E6R3,
terminó el proceso de
that
consulta pública de esta
yesterday
nueva
the public
norma, de esta
consultation process of
actualización de
this
la
new
norma.
standard and the
Estamos
update
en este
ended.
momento
And right
en el
now we are
análisis, en el proceso de
in the
análisis de todos los
analysis
comentarios que
process
nos enviaron en la consulta
of all the
pública.
comments that were sent
Y
in
al
the public
momento en que se
consultation.
publique la norma
And
final, la
when
versión
the
final de esta
final
norma,
version of our standard is
vamos
published,
a
we
adoptar
will
la guía
adopt
ICH
the
6R3 también como
ICH
parte fundamental
E6R3
de este
guideline
proceso
also
de
as a
transformación
fundamental part of this
que iniciamos
transformation
el
process
año pasado.
that we started
Así que
last
bueno,
year.
como desafío principal
So as
es
a
la
main challenge,
capacitación
we
de
have
todos
the
los
training
niveles,
at all
tanto de la
levels,
normativa, que como dije
both
antes
of
se
the
alinea a la
regulation that, as I
ICH
said,
6R3,
aligns
como
to
de esta nueva
ICH
versión de la
E6R3,
guía.
as well as to
Eso,
this new
digamos,
version of the guideline.
o sea, el primer desafío que
That was the
vamos a
first
tener que
challenge that
implementarlo
we're going to
a
have
todos
to
los
implement
actores internamente en
um,
ANMAT y luego también
with all the
externamente.
stakeholders internally and
Después
UNMAT, and then
también lo que
externally.
viene a traer la
Then,
guía en
after
cuanto
what the
al
guideline
concepto
brings in regards to the
el concepto de
concept
riesgo, de
of
proporcionalidad basado
risk
en
and
riesgo,
proportionality and
también nos
risk-based
parece interesante
proportionality,
y un
we also
desafío
think
poder
it's important and
anticipar
it's a
estos
challenge to
riesgos,
be able to anticipate
identificarlos
these
como
risks and
agencia regulatoria
identify
desde
them
la
as a
evaluación hasta la
regulatory agency
fiscalización
from
de
the
los ensayos
evaluation
clínicos
to the
y poder tener la
fiscalization of clinical
flexibilidad
trials and to be able to
para
have the
frente a un
flexibility
problema,
so
una
that in the face of
recurrencia
a
o
problem
un riesgo que
um,
nosotros
or a
advirtamos, poder
risk that
tener
we
o
can
dar una
find, we could
respuesta rápida
respond
y ser
quickly
proactivos.
and be
Entonces,
proactive.
bueno, eso también
So
entendemos
that
que, bueno, que puede llegar
is
a ser un
something that we
desafío,
also understand that could
fortalecer
be a
la
challenge,
fiscalización también
strengthening
basada en riesgo,
fiscalization,
desde la
also
selección de
risk-based,
inspecciones
from
hasta,
selection of
bueno, el trabajo en
inspections
campo,
to the field
considerando
work
también
and
todas las
considering
características
also
locales, ¿sí? que
all
se
the
agregan,
local
que a veces tenemos
characteristics that are
distintas
added. That
infraestructuras de
sometimes we
centros
have
de
different infrastructures
investigación,
for
investigadores que pueden
research
tener
centers
diferentes
and
niveles de
researchers that can have
experiencia en
different levels of
investigación
expertise in
clínica,
clinical
registros de historias
research and
clínicas también,
records and
distinto
clinical
grado de,
um,
algunos ya tienen
clinical
registros
records.
electrónicos
Some
muy
also have
avanzados y en otros casos
very
todavía están
advanced
en un
clinical
proceso de
records at this point, and in
modernización de su
other
tecnología.
cases, they're still in the process of
Así que, bueno,
modernization of their
considerar,
technology.
digamos, las
So,
características
considering
locales
the
para poder
local
implementar
characteristics to be able
esta
to
guía y que la
implement this
implementación sea
guideline and for the
exitosa.
implementation to be successful.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Gracias,
Leo.
Laura.
Thank you,
Sí.
Laura.
Please remember to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to send your question. Próxima pregunta es para Anvisa.
Next question is for
¿Cómo
Anvisa.
Anvisa acredita que
How
la
does Anvisa
actualización de la
accredit
E6
that the
va a impactar la
update
qualidad
of E6 will
en
impact
integridad de los
quality
ensayos clínicos no Brasil?
so that we
Então,
could
com
see?
relação ao 3, eu acredito que os ensaios clínicos vão ter maior qualidade, integridade, justamente
Right
porque os
now,
esforços
we
agora
are
vão ser
considering quality and
dedicados ao que
integrity,
importa, né?
and
Então,
that the efforts will be dedicated to what we really care
toda a
about.
dedicação mesmo vai ser focada no que
All
de
the
maior risco,
dedication will be
no
focused
que o que ele é adequado para o
on
propósito do estudo
where there are
e
more
até
risks
como a
and what is
Rebeca comentou,
adapted
né, o
to the
E8 ele
purpose
traz
of the study.
a definição de
And
fatores
as
críticos de
Rebecca
qualidade. Então,
mentioned,
quando se inicia o
E8
estudo, antes de
brings
iniciar,
the risks
para
of
desenhar
quality.
o
When we
estudo, se
started the
pensar
study,
nesses fatores críticos de
before
qualidade
starting in the
para
design of
evitar
the study,
qualquer
we think about the
intromissão do
quality
estudo ou se
factors to
tiver ter a
avoid
mitigação dos
any kind
riscos,
of
né? Então, eu
interconnection
acredito que
between
com
the
essa
study and
abordagem, uma nova
also to
abordagem,
mitigate the risks.
pensando
I
no
believe
risco
that with this
proporcional,
new approach
no
and
perfil for
thinking
purpose,
about the proportional
com
risk
certeza
and
os ensaios clínicos terão
that
maior
everything is fit for
qualidade e
purpose,
a integridade
these
dos dados também
clinical
vai ser
studies
melhor.
will
E
surely
isso também,
have
né, só reforçando que
more
daí então
quality
evita
and the data
estudos com
integrity will be
complexidade
much better.
desnecessária,
So
né? E
this
como
will
poderia a Rebeca
avoid
comentar,
studies with
também a
unnecessary
sobrecarga, né,
complexities, as it
diminui,
was
porque
commented
você foca no
before,
que
and
realmente importa.
the burden will reduce a lot, which is what
Excelente.
really matters.
Ese punto mira reforza la
Excellent.
importancia da integridad de los
This
datos
point
para
reinforces the
mantener confianza
importance
en los sistemas.
of data
Obrigado.
integrity so that we can trust the
Bueno,
system
vuelvo
better.
yo.
Thank you so much. Okay,
Esta pregunta
I'm back.
parcialmente fue
This
respondida,
question
pero
was
bueno,
partially
¿qué
answered, but
estrategias estamos
what
actualmente
strategies are
usando o
we currently
planificando usar
using or
para
planning on
promover lo que es
using
el entrenamiento
to
y el
promote
conocimiento de la
training and knowledge
E6R3 entre
of
investigadores y sponsors
E6R3 between
y reguladores
researchers
en
and
cada país?
sponsors
Y
and
la pregunta es
regulators in each
para
country?
Anmat, para Laura.
And the question is for Anmat, for Laura.
Bien, sí, para
Okay,
nosotros
for us,
el entrenamiento y la capacitación
training
parece fundamental para poder
is
implementar la
fundamental to
guía
be
y,
able
bueno, en
to
nuestro caso
implement the
también
guidelines, and in our
la
case,
actualización normativa que
also
lo que
the regulatory
contempla la
update.
norma nueva son
And what the
requisitos
new
locales
standard
de
contemplates is
conceptos
local
que
requirements of
surgen de la
concepts
guía ICH.
that come up from ICH.
Como estrategia se
And
planifica una
as a
capacitación
strategy,
interna
we plan an internal
y
planning,
también a nivel
training,
externa de
and
todos los
also
actores,
externally of
enfocando por ahí el
all actors,
contenido
focusing
del
the
material
content of the
a brindar
materials
de
to
acuerdo al
provide
área de interés de
based on the
cada
area
actor.
of interest of each
Internamente
stakeholder.
ya lo hemos iniciado,
Internally,
desde que
we've
salió
already
la
started
ICH,
since
hemos hecho bueno, la
ICH
lectura
came out.
individual por
We
parte
did
del
the
equipo de ANMAT
individual
de la
reading on
guía,
part of the ANMA team,
participación, digamos, en reuniones en donde
participation
hemos
in
discutido los nuevos
meetings where we have
principios
discussed
y los nuevos
the new
conceptos
principles and the new concepts.
internamente de la guía. Hemos
Internally, in the
participado también
guideline,
en algún
we have
webinar que esto también
participated in a couple
moviliza
of
al equipo
webinars,
como
which
para que
also
podamos
mobilizes the team
leer e investigar más acerca
so
y
that we
profundizar
can
más
read
acerca de los
and research
conceptos de la
more
guía.
on the
Y
guidelines
también
concept.
estamos
And
en un programa
also, we
preparando,
are
finalizando un
in a
programa de
program preparing
capacitación
and finalizing a
que
training
incluye
program
distintos
that
recursos o
includes
distintas
different
estrategias, guías
resources
como
from
material
different
didáctico
strategies,
interactivo,
like
el
interactive
uso, bueno, propio de la
materials, the
plataforma,
use of a
que sea,
platform
digamos, para subir este
that
material y
is
para el
to
aprendizaje de estos
upload this
conceptos,
material and to learn these
encuentros
concepts,
sincrónicos
synchronic
interesados con las
meetings with
personas que se
the
van a capacitar
actors or
y
the people who
estamos
are going to get
pensando
trained.
en
We're
armar
thinking
ya
about
casos
building
prácticos,
practical
ejercicios.
cases and
También estamos
exercises.
elaborando un
We're
documento de
also
preguntas y
drafting a
respuestas
document
que lo vamos
with
a poner
questions and
públicamente
answers, and we will
disponible en
be
la
making
página
it
web de
publicly
ANMAT
available at the ANMAT
para todo el
webpage
público.
for the
Y
entire
también
audience. And
finalmente,
also,
digamos,
finally,
el punto, digamos, que nos parece muy
a point
importante
that we
es la
believe is very important
retroalimentación,
is
como para
feedback,
poder hacer una mejora
so that we
continua en
can
lo que es
have
el proceso
continuous
de
improvement
capacitación, es decir,
of the
evaluar la
training
eficiencia,
process,
la
meaning
eficacia de la
assessing the
capacitación
efficacy
a
of
través de la
training
retroalimentación para
through
luego
feedback so
mejorar
that
o
we can later
implementar
improve
las
or
modificaciones que sean
implement the
necesarias.
necessary modifications.
Perfecto, Laura.
Perfect, Laura.
Vamos a continuar.
We will
Esta pregunta es
continue,
para
and this question is for
COFEPRIS.
COFEPRIS.
Queremos agradecer su participación
We
en
want
este
to
panel.
thank
La
you for
pregunta
your
es,
participation in this panel,
considerando la
and the question
importancia de
is,
la actualización de la
considering the
versión
importance of the
E6,
update
revisión
of
3
the
para la
version
regulación y
E6
supervisión
Review
de ensayos
3 for the
clínicos, nos gustaría
regulation and
conocer
supervision of clinical
qué
trials,
estrategias
we'd
adicionales se
like to
están
know what
implementando para
additional
apoyar la
strategies are being
implementación
implemented
de
to
esta guía.
support the implementation of this guideline.
Sí, bueno, pues como
Yes,
les comentaba, a
as I
través
was
de
saying,
nuestro
through our
cambio en nuestro marco
change
normativo
in our regulatory
para poder
framework,
implementar esta
to
guía,
be able to implement
tendremos
this
que
guideline, we
hacer
will have
estrategias
to
de capacitación,
do
pero
training
también adecuar
strategies, but
la parte de la
also
vigilancia, ¿no?
adapt
Que será importante,
surveillance, which will
ya que
be
tendrá un
important
enfoque
because
diferente,
we'll have a
tendrá un
different
enfoque hacia
focus. It
las
will have a
buenas
focus
prácticas
based
clínicas
on
y
good
no
clinical
como
practices and not
pues se
as
estaba llevando a cabo, que
as we
solamente
were doing it
sobre los
before, which was
establecimientos, ¿no?
only on the
Entonces,
establishments.
tenemos que
So
hacer
we
como
have
una
to
capacitación
have
constante
a
y
constant
una,
training and
pues, promover todo lo que
promoting
conlleve esta
everything
implementación de la
that
guía a
this
través de
implementation
nuestro
of the
marco
guideline
normativo.
leads to through our regulatory
Posteriormente
framework. And
estaré
then
comentando
later, I will
algunos
be
puntos que se
talking
estarán,
about a
que
couple
además se
points
están
that
sumando, pero
are
bueno,
adding
para
also.
esta
But
pregunta
for this
particular,
question
ese sería
specifically, this
básicamente
would
lo que
basically
estaremos
be
haciendo.
what we would be doing.
Excelente.
Excellent.
Bueno,
Well,
sigo yo entonces.
I'm next.
Otra pregunta para la
Another
doctora
question
Traversi.
for Dr.
La
Traversi.
ICH6R3
The
enfatiza en el uso de
ICH6R3
tecnologías
emphasizes
digitales
on the use
y
of
una
digital
aproximación
technologies
risk-based,
and
basada en
a
riesgo.
risk-based
¿Cómo se estaría
approximation.
integrando estas
How would you
herramientas
be
en nuestra
integrating
práctica
these
en clinical
tools
trials en
in
nuestro
our
país?
clinical trials practices in our country?
Sí, es importante también
Yes, it's
contextualizar
important to
el avance que ha habido en
contextualize
los últimos
the
años de las
advance of the past
tecnologías
few
que se han
years of the
incorporado
technologies
dentro de lo que es la
that have been
investigación
incorporated
clínica.
within clinical research,
Esto ha transformado
and
los
this has
modelos de
transformed the
investigación de
models
diseños tradicionales
of
en
research
diseños
from
con
traditional
elementos
designs to
descentralizados,
designs with
con el uso de
decentralized
herramientas digitales tanto para la
elements, with the
recuperación de
use
los
of
datos
digital
como para
tools both for
el
data collection as
monitoreo de
well
los
as for monitoring of
participantes, el uso de
participants, the
telemedicina,
use
de
of
dispositivos, que
telemedicine,
es
of
lo que llamamos
devices
dispositivos
that we
portátiles
know
y
are
tecnología
portable, like handheld
interactiva.
and interactive
Y en
technology.
respuesta a estos
And in
avances, en
response to
particular
these
en Argentina,
advances,
se emitió
specifically in
en noviembre
Argentina,
del 2023
in
una
November
guía sobre el
2023,
uso de
there was a
elementos
guideline issued on
descentralizados.
the use of
Esto de
decentralized
alguna manera
elements,
permite
and
que
this
se apliquen
somehow
tecnologías
allows
en salud
applying these
en los
technologies in
ensayos
health in
clínicos.
clinical
Allí,
trials.
bueno, se listan una serie de
And
requisitos locales
there's a
en
couple of
relación
local requirements
a este
listed in
tipo
relation
de
to
elementos,
these types of
a estudios
elements,
de estas
to
características.
studies of these
Y
characteristics,
también respecto,
and
digamos, a la
also in
situación
regards
local
to
en
the local
Argentina,
situation in
en los
Argentina.
últimos años hubo una
In the past few
modernización
years, there
de lo
was
que
a
son los registros,
modernization of the
registros,
records
las historias clínicas.
and
Han,
clinical
han
charts,
migrado y
clinical
son
records
historias
have
clínicas
they've
electrónicas que
migrated, and they
muchas
are
veces tienen
electronic clinical
interoperabilidad con
records
otros
that many
sistemas.
times have
Por supuesto que es una
interoperability with other
transición,
systems. Of course,
digamos, algunos
it's
registros
a
todavía
transition.
están en
Some
proceso de
records are still
maduración,
in
pero
maturity
otros, digamos, han
process, but
avanzado
some others
mucho.
have
Y en
advanced a
este
lot.
caso,
And in
respecto a
this
estas
case,
tecnologías, en
in
general,
regards to
se
these
deben siempre
technologies in
asegurar
general, we must always
que su
ensure
uso sea adecuado, digamos,
that
al
their use
objetivo
is
del ensayo
adequate based on
clínico,
the
a las
objective of the
características de
clinical
nuestra
trial,
población o de
the
nuestros
characteristics of our
participantes,
population or the participants,
identificar y gestionar los riesgos
identifying and
asociados. Pueden
managing the
haber, por ejemplo,
risks,
fallas en
associated
estas
risks.
tecnologías,
There could be
errores
failures in
de
these
medición,
technologies,
a problemas de
measurement errors,
ciberseguridad,
cybersecurity
poder, digamos,
problems, and
gestionar
being
este
able to
riesgo.
manage this risk.
Siempre recomendamos que se
and we always recommend to work under standard operational procedures and that these procedures contemplate contingency plans in case of these failures to be able to take the corrective measures and have alternatives when they do happen. I mean, we know that this can happen at some point. So in regards to the risk-based criteria, the new regulation, what we incorporated was a concept. So risk-based criteria applies from the assessment to fiscalization. So in the evaluation of clinical trials, we incorporated the low regulatory risk studies concept. So this allows us to have a differentiated procedure to assess these low regulatory risk studies, different from the ones that are high risk, for which we contemplate the possibility of having the sponsors, for example, be able to request a meeting before the presentation of the clinical trial to be able to discuss and establish agreements, anticipate possible risks, mitigate them maybe from before the actual clinical trial is presented for its evaluation. And this addressed, as I said before, based on a risk-based criteria for phase 1 studies, which are the most risky. We also have a regulation that has requirements on the characteristics that the centers must have, and the staff that carries out these types of clinical trials must have a specific authorization by ANMAT to be able to carry out first-time studies in human subjects. All of this, as I said, with a risk-based focus that goes from the evaluation to the fiscalization. For example, for fiscalization infections, we have incorporated the criteria of selection of infections of risk, and also when we will inspect on the field, we address, of course, all processes, but if the reason for the inspection was, for example, because of relevant information that was already received, we also focus on what motivated the inspection, precisely to address this problem specifically.
Excelente.
Excellent.
Algunas preguntas aquí en el
We have
chat.
some questions
Sí.
here in the
Esta
chat.
pregunta es para Anvisa. Voy a aprovechar de hacer esta pregunta
Question
a
is
Anvisa.
for
Consolidar
Anvisa.
dos preguntas que tenemos.
I want to consolidate two
¿Cuál
questions that we have.
previsión de Anvisa adoptar
What
o
is the
ICH
provision
E6
of, or the
R3?
forecast of Anvisa to adopt the ICH E6R3?
Então, só para contextualizar, né, atualmente a
Okay,
gente usa a versão
to
AR2,
contextualize,
revisão 2
currently
do guia,
are
tanto
with
para
version
analisar ensaios
R2,
clínicos, quanto para as inspeções de boas
both
práticas
for
clínicas,
the
né? A
analysis
gente ainda
of the
não tem uma
clinical
data
trials as
definida para
well
quando a gente
as
vai
for clinical
implementar o
practice.
R3,
There isn't
justamente
a
porque a gente queria
defined
entender um
date
pouco
for
mais
the
o
implementation
impacto
of R3
da
because we'd like to
adequação, né,
understand
do
a
tempo
bit
para
better about
adequar
the
a esse novo
impact of
guia.
this
Então, a
adaptation and
ideia
the
da
time
Anvisa é fazer
that we have
workshops
to take
que
for to adapt this
participar de
guideline. So
workshops
the
como esse,
idea
né, que traz
is
as
to hold
informações
some
das
webinars
atualizações do
like these
R3
ones that we're
para
going
ter um
where we're
engajamento
going to
sobre o
bring
guia,
information from
promover
R3 so
treinamentos
that we
para
can
e
see
principalmente para tentar
what the implementation of the guideline
pegar
is like and do
quais
some
são os
training
desafios para
to
conseguir
be able to
implementar
take
a revisão
and know
3
the
no
challenges
Brasil.
for the
E aí, a partir de
implementation
então, a
of
gente
Review
vai
3 in Brazil.
implementar,
And
né, o R3
additionally, we
e,
are
ao mesmo
going
tempo,
to
capacitar
implement R3 and
os
we are
atores
going to
envolvidos na
train
pesquisa clínica, quanto
both
os próprios inspetores de boas
actors
práticas
involved
clínicas na revisão 3,
with clinical
para que todos
trials as
estejam
well
alinhados
as
principalmente com esse
clinical
conceito
practice so that
do
everybody
quality
is
by design,
aligned
né, de
in the
focar na
concept
qualidade, considerando
of all the study
o que é
to
adequado
focus
para o
on quality and
propósito, riscos
considering
associados e tudo mais.
what is adequate to the
Ótimo, mira,
purpose and the
capacitação
risks
é realmente esencial
associated.
para garantir
Excellent.
una implementación efectiva.
Training is
Obrigado.
excellent. It's
Sí,
fundamental
tengo acá una pregunta también en
for an
línea para
effective use.
México, para la
Thank you.
doctora
And for
Legaspi.
Mexico,
Es también,
this
¿qué
is a question for Dr.
necesitaría
Legaspi.
México para implementar
What would
esta nueva
Mexico
normativa
need
ICH?
to implement
Y si
this
podrían
new ICH
incorporarse también
regulation?
conceptos de ensayos
And if we could
descentralizados
incorporate concepts of
para México.
decentralized studies for Mexico.
Sí, bueno, pues como les
Well,
comentaba,
as I
a
was
través de nuestro
saying,
marco
through
normativo
our
es como
regulatory
vamos a estar
framework is
implementando
how the way that we're
esta
going to be
guía de
implementing this
E6 a la
guideline
edición 3.
of
Algunos
E6
puntos de la
Review 3.
edición 3,
Some points of
porque
Review 3,
básicamente
because
los
basically
trabajos iniciaron con la
work
revisión
started with the
E2, ¿no?
review
Voy a
E2.
adelantarme un poquito.
I am going
Estamos
to I'll go a little bit forward. We're working for the publication of other guidelines. So basically, in September, we hope to have a lot of the guidelines implemented of ICH so that we can adjust the regulatory framework as well as our strength within clinical trials in COFEPRIS.
Excelente.
Excellent.
Tenemos una pregunta, una última
We
pregunta.
have one final question. Yes, we have one final question for Dr. Traversi, also online. What do you think about ANMAT's possibility of obtaining informed consent at a distance? For example, through a Zoom video call or WhatsApp video call. Do you think this is feasible? Oh, yeah, first of all, we consider essential that communication be done face to face between the possible participant and the researcher. This is described in the decentralized elements guideline, and the possibility is allowed of having a communication through this way, like a video conference, every time that it's possible to identify the participant and mutually. And the point, there's a legal point related to the signature of the sign informed consent that our regulation establishes to be able to give a value or to give faith of the identity of who is signing, that it should be signed by hand. So we can do this in a specific case. Part of the process can be done via a video conference, but the signature needs to be by hand by the people who intervene in the process.
Okay.
Okay.
Tengo una más acá que quedó.
I have one more here that was
también
left,
para ANMAT.
also for
¿Cuáles son
ANMAT.
las expectativas de la
What are the
agencia respecto a los
expectations of the
sponsors
agency in
para
regards
lo
to
que es su sistema de
sponsors
calidad y sus
for their
prácticas de
quality
risk-bearing?
system and the
Si hay alguna
risk-based
expectativa
practices?
con esta nueva
Are
guía
there any
respecto a los
expectations with these
sponsors?
guidelines for the sponsors?
Sí, bueno, o sea,
Yes,
tal cual como lo describe la guía, tienen
as
que
the guideline
trabajar para
describes it,
implementar y
they have
demostrar
to work and
implementación de un sistema
implement
de
and demonstrate the
calidad
implementation in the quality
sólido,
system that needs to
documentado,
be solid
siempre,
and
digamos, con un
documented and
enfoque proactivo,
always with a
alineado, bueno, con todo
proactive
lo que es
focus
el
along
ciclo del ensayo
the
clínico,
cycle of the
como bien lo
clinical
dice la guía,
trial,
desde el
as the
diseño
guideline says,
hasta
from
la
the design
finalización del ensayo
to the
clínico.
finalization of the
Nosotros
clinical
siempre insistimos con el
trial.
trabajo
We
bajo
always
procedimientos
insist
operativos
with work under
estándares,
standard
se identifiquen, que se
operating
evalúen y se
procedures that
mitiguen
should
los
be
riesgos
identified,
de
assessed,
forma
and
continua,
mitigate
que
risks
no sea solo
continuously,
limitado al
and that it's not
momento del
just limited to the
monitoreo,
moment of monitoring,
bueno, y priorizar
but
aspectos
also
críticos en relación a
prioritizing
la
critical
protección de los
aspects in regards to
participantes,
the
a
protection
la
of
integridad de los
participants
datos y
and the
siempre
integrity
adaptado,
of the
como
data, and
dije al
always
principio, al
adapted,
contexto
as I said at the
local, a
beginning,
nuestra
to the
población,
local context and
teniendo en
our
cuenta las
population,
distancias
keeping in
que
mind
hay,
the
que es una población
distances
geográficamente
that we have,
dispersa, tenemos
that it's
centros
a
geográficamente
geographically
dispersos,
dispersed area. We have
diferentes infraestructuras
geographically
en los
dispersed centers,
centros, o sea, las
different infrastructures
características
at the centers.
locales
So
también como
local
para poder
characteristics also
anticipar riesgos ya
to be
desde la
able to
selección
anticipate
del
risks
centro hasta,
from the
bueno, todo lo que es la
selection of the
implementación del
center to
ensayo
the
clínico.
implementation
Para
of the
nosotros es
clinical trial.
fundamental
We also think
mantener
it's
una comunicación
fundamental to keep
fluida con todos
a
los actores,
fluent
eso
communication with all the
también asegura la
stakeholders that
calidad.
I believe
Y
also
también frente a ANMAT,
ensures quality. And in the case
somos
of
una agencia
ANMAT,
de puertas
we're
abiertas,
an
siempre
open
con
doors
los regulados
agency,
estamos disponibles
always
para cualquier
we're
duda
always
o
available for
consulta
any
cuando la
doubts or
tengan.
questions
Siempre
when you
realizar
have
una
it.
consulta a tiempo
I
puede de
think
alguna
that
manera también
a question
mitigar
on time
un
can
riesgo o alguna cuestión
mitigate
que después pueda llegar
a
a ser un
risk
problema.
that can be a problem later on.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Perfecto. Bueno,
Perfect.
Cecilia,
Cecilia,
para cerrar,
I hand the floor
a todos los panelistas y
so you
continuamos
can
para
hand
cerrar el webinar.
so you can thank the panelists, and then
Bueno,
I will
muchas
close the
gracias
webinar.
entonces a
Well,
las
thank you so
agencias
much to the
de Brasil, al
agencies
doctor
of
Legazpi, al doctor
Brazil, Dr.
Traversi,
Legazpi,
y la
Dr.
doctora Miriam
Traversi,
por unirse,
Dr.
por
Miriam
esta
for
apertura
joining, for
a recibir preguntas
being so
de
open
toda la
to
audiencia, que
answering questions
tenemos
from
gente
the
de
entire audience.
sponsor,
We
de
have people
comités,
from sponsors, from
de distintos
committees, from
actores.
different
Así que bueno,
stakeholders.
les
So
agradecemos mucho
we
su
thank
participación.
you for your
Leo.
participation.
Excelente. Gracias, Cecilia. Un placer moderar
Excellent.
este panel.
Thank you, Cecilia.
On
It's
behalf of
been a
the
pleasure to
organizers,
moderate this
AMIF,
panel.
KM, FIPharma, IFPMA, Interpharma, and Sintopharma, we sincerely Thank you for participating in this final session of our webinar series on regional perspective on good clinical practices with a focus on the proposed change in the ICH E6 R3 guideline. We also want to emphasize the progress represented by Latin America's participation as member and observers in ICH. This role will support the continued evolution of regulatory frameworks in the region and strengthen our ability to align with international standards. To formally close this series, I now invite Lydia Smart-Sick, Associate Manager of Regulatory Policy and ICH Coordinator at IFPMA, International Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industry, to deliver the closing remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Leonardo, and really thanks to audience and to speakers. And as we come to the close of this LATAM ICH webinar series, I want to take just a moment to reflect on the journey we've shared over these 3 sessions. We have explored important topics, exchanged knowledge, and deepened our understanding of the International Council for Harmonization and its role in shaping global health care. The ICH is more than a global standard setting body. It's a platform that brings together regulatory and industry experts to ensure medicines are developed and delivered safely, efficiently, and with the highest quality for patients worldwide. Our discussions first on the benefits of joining ICH, as well as deep dives into the M4QR2 draft guideline during the second webinar, and today E6 R3 have shown not only the practical value of these guidelines, but also the collaborative spirit that makes harmonization possible. On behalf of IFPMA, I would like to thank you to associations, FIPharma, Interpharma, KME, AMIF, and Sindus Pharma. Also, huge thanks to experts who supported the development of the content. Finally, the huge thanks to speakers from regulatory authorities and the ICH Secretariat, whose perspectives and guidance have enriched these discussions and inspiring us all. As we move forward, it's important, let us remember that engagement with ICH is a commitment, and to quality, it's a commitment to quality, to scientific integrity and efficiency in medicines development. And above all, it's a commitment to the patients who rely on safe and effective medicines. By participating in ICH initiatives, learning from global best practices and applying these standards, we strengthen healthcare system across regions and contribute to a safer, more harmonized global health ecosystem. Thank you all for your time, for your engagement, and your dedication throughout this series. Together, I think that we are not just participants in a webinar series, we are part of the movement shaping the future of healthcare in LATAM and beyond. And let us continue this journey with the same passion, with the same collaboration and commitment to the quality that has brought us here today at the end. And thank you once again, and I look forward to continuing this important work together. Wishing you a nice rest of the day, and thanks a lot one more time to all of you.